officials, when they arrived, they saw several black plastic bags with what appeared to be the human remains of two women who were cut in pieces.
Two people riding bicycles on the Camino Real road in northwest Juarez came across the dead body of a woman on Sunday. The victim's body was found on the side of the road, and according to Juarez police, the woman was murdered with visible severe injuries to the face.
Every week since his daughter disappeared more than a year ago, Gaspar Mendoza has waited outside the state prosecutor's office in Ciudad Juarez, looking for help.
It seems like the air swallowed her up, or she's on Mars. I just don't know.
Mendoza's 18-year-old daughter is one of at least 180 women in Juarez who have disappeared in the last year alone. Like so many others, she was last seen in downtown Juarez.
Mexico, a beautiful country, overtaken and now ridden with terror, crime, and hyperviolence for so long, it has unfortunately ingrained its way into the nation's rich culture, like an unrelenting, constantly mutating cancer that seems to have no treatment. Whether it's in the southern region with Gulf states like Tabasco and Veracruz, or criminal organizations such as Los Zetas and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, more commonly known as CJNG, continue to operate and reign in terror, or in the opposite end of the country, in the northern region in border states such as Sonora and Chihuahua, where cartels such as the Sinaloa Cartel and Juarez Cartel continue their reign. In this video, we will stay in the northern region of Mexico and focus on the border city of Juarez during a certain time period where cartel activity was not the only problem the citizens of Juarez had to worry about, but a boogeyman of the city, a serial killer that officially haunted its inhabitants for over a decade, but yet somehow still continues to terrorize even after death. As early as 1993, the young female inhabitants of Juarez have been the unfortunate target of abduction, sexual assault, and violent murders. The grisly phenomenon is known as the femicide of Juarez, or more commonly known as in Spanish, Las Muertas de Juarez. The targeted age group seemed to be young women ranging from ages as young as preteens to 35, many of them traveling over to Juarez from nearby villages and rural areas, seeking work for a better way of life, not only for themselves, but for their families. Many of these women would leave early in the morning to work in factories known as maquiladoras. Maquiladoras are factories that thrive off of cheap labor and exploiting their workers for the benefit of usually foreign-owned companies. During this time, many maquiladoras were opening throughout Juarez, providing many women a chance to earn a steady income. These early morning and late night commutes would leave these women susceptible to the aforementioned acts of violence, with some women found still having their work outfits on after their murder. On January 23, 1993, the first official victim of the Juarez Ripper was a young woman by the name of Alma Chavira Farrell. Her body was found beaten and showed signs of sexual assault. Her cause of death? Strangulation. It wasn't long after that many other young women were being murdered similarly. Their bodies found in the outskirts of the city, but now there seemed to be an unmistakable trend. Many of the subsequent victims were found with slash wounds to their breasts. By year's end, there were 16 more female murders acknowledged by the Juarez police. 4 of the cases were solved, while the remaining 12 were not. At least 4 of the unsolved cases shared a similarity to the possible victims of the Ripper. In 1994, 8 female victims were acknowledged by the Juarez police, with possible suspects but no arrests. Some victims as young as 11 years of age, at least of which again sharing a similar age group of the possible aforementioned victims of the Ripper. A police criminologist by the name of Oscar Menéz Grijalva was brought in to help assist the case of the alarming rise in female murders, stating what appeared to be the obvious in a serial killer in Juarez. But his words were surprisingly waved off. An interview with Irma Perez Franco, the mother of a 20-year-old victim, was recorded stating that the authorities seemed indifferent about the whole case. By 1995, more than double the amount of females were found murdered before year's end. 8 of the cases would go unsolved, but this time 3 of the women's corpses were found with definite patterns of the Ripper. Each had their right breast severed and their left nipple bitten off. As the number of female murders and violence continued to rise, so did the community's outrage. As the ages of the females were getting younger, families were desperately searching for answers, and more importantly, a solution to put an end to this nightmare. And on October 1995, it seemed they would get one. An arrest was finally made. The suspect, an Egyptian chemist by the name of Abdel Latif Sharif. Prior to his most recent arrest and conviction in 1994, resulting in his relocation to Juarez, Sharif had an extensive criminal record, including, but not limited to, assault, sexual assault, financial fraud, drunk driving, and more. Unfortunately for Sharif, his arrest alerted a former acquaintance who alerted Sharif to Border Patrol as a fugitive from deportation proceedings, a 2-year-old pending matter involving the captivity and sexual assault of a woman in his Texas home. While awaiting trial for his DUI, Sharif's defense lawyer proposed a deal. If the latest charges of drunk driving were dismissed, Sharif would voluntarily leave the country. The proposal was agreed upon, and Sharif left the U.S. for Mexico, specifically Juarez, to work at one of the many newly built maquiladoras. On the month of his arrest, Sharif was accused by a young maquiladora worker of sexual assault at his home, also stating that Sharif threatened to kill her and dump her corpse in Lote Bravo, a desert region where coincidentally other victims happened to be found. The charges were later withdrawn, but it wasn't long after that during their investigation, detectives would find out that Sharif had also dated 17-year-old Elizabeth Castro Garcia, who was found sexually assaulted and murdered months before. Ultimately, Sharif was charged with Garcia's murder and convicted in 1999, receiving a 30-year sentence. Now there has been speculation saying that Elizabeth Garcia was later found alive, and that the death that Sharif was charged with was that of a 16-year-old Sylvia Rivera Salas. Unfortunately, it's hard to find any information supporting that claim, but as we continue on with this story, we will find many other odd and interesting details involving the Juarez police, the suspects, and the investigation overall. Even after Sharif's arrest and being held in police custody, the killings didn't stop. The murders actually increased significantly. It wasn't more than 6 months after Sharif's arrest where at least 14 more females were found slain in the city, their ages ranging from 10 to 30. One of the victims, 15-year-old Adriana Torres, was found with the Ripper's trademark, a severed right breast and a missing left nipple. Embarrassed, the police were desperately seeking for answers, trying their best to appease the panicked and terrified residents of the city. Sharif was still their prime suspect, the monster that needed to be taken off the streets. They just needed another reason for why the murders were still occurring, an opportunity to explain. And it wasn't long before they got their chance. On April 8th, 1996, the body of 18-year-old Rosaria Garcia Leal was found sexually assaulted and mutilated. The police quickly began their search for possible suspects, one of them being Hector Olivares Villalba, a member of a local street gang called Los Rebeldes. Now officially, Hector claimed he participated in Garcia's murder back in December of '95, claiming that half a dozen of his fellow gang members, including the gang's leader, Sergio Armendariz Diaz, or better known as El Diablo, were also involved. It wasn't until later on that Hector would recant his confession, saying that he was forced to make it due to torture by the police while in custody. Off of Hector's confession, several nightclubs were raided, and around 300 suspects were detained. Out of the 300, it was finally whittled down to 9 prime suspects. The 9 suspects, along with Hector, were alleged of plotting with Sharif to continue murdering young women around Juarez, making it seem as if the real Ripper was still at large. Local police claimed that some of the rebels had even visited Sharif while in jail and were paid for their copycat killings. One of the 9 suspects, a Juan Contreras Jurado, aka El Grande, would go on to state that El Diablo would have him collect an envelope during one of those visits to Sharif containing $4,000 in cash. Later, Contreras would also go on to state that he, El Diablo, and fellow Rebeldes would go on to sexually assault and murder a young female by the name of Lucy. Similar to his fellow Rebeldes member Hector, Contreras would also later recant his statement, and this time the charges were dropped for 5 of the 9 Rebeldes members, including Hector. The remaining members, though, would be incarcerated for Lucy's murder. Like Hector, the other Rebeldes would all go on to claim they were tortured by the police, forcing them to make their statements. Some displaying burn scars from the results of cigars and cigarettes being used. Despite all the claims and accusations, though, the local authorities would continue to stand by their charges, claiming that Sharif and Los Rebeldes worked together to commit 17 murders. A medical examiner brought from Chihuahua would even go as far as to tell reporters that dental casts from Armendariz are an identical match to the bite marks found on the breasts of at least 3 victims. However, even with Sharif and his supposed multiple accomplices behind bars, the killings did not stop. And much like the narrative surrounding Sharif and his arrest, not only did the killings continue, they increased. Between April of '96 to November of '96, at least 16 more females were found murdered. In some cases, the bodies were found in such a state where determination of sexual assault or cause of death were deemed impossible. In 1997, there were 17 unsolved murders. Again, the ages ranging from 10 to 30 years of age. 7 never being identified. Several were sexually assaulted, and multiple causes of death were determined from shootings, strangulations, stabbings, and even burnings. 1998 was the city's worst year yet. 23 recorded victims, 6 unidentified. The method of killings sharing a similarity to prior victims. By this point, the long-running investigation and its body count was beginning to become a blur. Some media outlets reporting at this point more than 100 women sexually assaulted and murdered. A month later from the same source, 117. One had the victims at 98, while a women's advocacy group called Women for Juarez had the number between 130 and 150. The body count had gotten so high that the case was no longer a city problem. The word got out all over the country, with Mexico's Human Rights Commission issuing a report chastising the police. Still holding on to Sharif as the main suspect behind it all, by year's end, on December 9th, police would inform the media that at least 17 bodies show enough in common in terms of how the bodies were left, where they were buried, and how they were mutilated, that investigators have come to the conclusion that at least one serial killer is at work, and that over 70 other cases bear enough similarities that multiple copycats may be at work. In the early months of 1999, the bodies continued to appear. Sharif's trial for the murder of Elizabeth Castro just began, and a new group of suspects would be arrested and linked to Sharif. On March 18th, an unnamed 14-year-old girl would seek refuge at a stranger's home in the outskirts of Juarez. Bloody and battered, she would go on to tell her survival story of how she was sexually assaulted and nearly choked to death by the hands of a maquiladora bus driver by the name of Jesus Guardado Marquez. Upon a background check, it was revealed that Marquez had one prior conviction for sexual assault. But by the time the police were out looking for Marquez, he had already fled the city along with his pregnant wife. His arrest was finally made in Durango a few days later. Upon interrogation, police claimed that Marquez confessed to multiple murders, as well as naming 4 accomplices: Victor Moreno Rivera, Agustin Toribio Castillo, Bernardo Hernando Fernandez, and one Jose Gaspar Ceballos Chavez. Like Marquez, all 4 were maquiladora bus drivers, and for the case, collectively dubbed Los Chauffeurs. Police also claimed that Moreno was the ringleader for the team of murderers, even going as far as saying that the 5 bus drivers were also in cahoots with Sharif in another copycat scheme to free him from prison. Again though, similar to the members of Los Rebeldes, Marquez claimed that he was beaten and tortured by police to get a confession. Charged with a total of 20 murders, all of the Los Chauffeurs denied any role in the murders. They would all go into shocking detail of how brutal their confinement was, including, but not limited to, beatings, strangulation, and being shocked with electricity. Their confessions were a result of the torture and should not be trusted. When Sharif was asked if he had any contact or any type of a relationship with the bus drivers, he denied and continued to claim his innocence. Murders would not only continue into the new millennium, but increase, as not only were bodies constantly being discovered throughout the city and its outskirts, but in some cases, mass graves containing close to a dozen victims. It wasn't until 2001 where another 2 suspects would enter the story. On Tuesday and Wednesday, November 6th and 7th of 2001, skeletal remains of 8 or more women were found in a vacant lot 300 yards from the Association of Maquiladoras headquarters, a group representing Juarez's U.S.-owned export assembly plants. On November 10th, Chihuahua officials announced the arrest of 2 28-year-old bus drivers for the 8, at the time, unidentified victims. One, Javier Garcia Uribe, and Gustavo Gonzalez Meza. Fernando Medina, a spokesperson for the prosecutor's office, claimed both men belonged to a gang whose members are serving time for at least 20 of the sexual assault murders, and that they have identified the remains of the 8 female victims. 19-year-old Maria Costa, 20-year-old Claudia Gonzalez, 15-year-old Esmeralda Herrera, 20-year-old Guadalupe Luna, 20-year-old Barbara Martinez, 19-year-old Veronica Martinez, 17-year-old Laura Ramos, and 17-year-old Myra Reyes. In a similar theme, with many of the past suspects, Meza and Uribe would both go on to say that their confessions were a result of torture by the hands of the police. The outrage got to the point where their lawyers were receiving death threats. In a wild related story, one of the lawyers, a Mario Escobedo Jr., was killed by police in a high-speed chase on February 2002 after officers allegedly mistook him for a fugitive. A judge would later declare the shooting to be in self-defense. 11 weeks later, on April 22, it would come out that DNA tests actually failed to confirm any of the early victims' identifications, and it wouldn't be until November of 2002 that prosecutors would reveal that the new DNA tests would only confirm the identity of a Veronica Martinez, while the other 7 would still go unidentified. Meza would later go on to die from complications after surgery in jail on February 8th, 2003. The arrests of Uribe and Meza would bring the arrest total to 51 by some estimated reports, but like the previous arrests, it wouldn't take long until another female body was found. Less than a week after Uribe and Meza were jailed, a female body was stripped and beaten to death in the city. Going back just 6 days later, after the accidental death of attorney Escobedo Jr., the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights sent out Marta Altolaguirre to investigate reports that protesters around the city were being harassed and threatened by the police. This new publicity moved then Mexican President Vicente Fox to order a new investigation by federal crime specialists. Now attracting global publicity, on March 9th, 2002, Texas state legislators joined in on a binational protest march throughout El Paso. During this time period, Jorge Campos Murillo, a federal deputy attorney general in Mexico City, created headlines when he claimed that some of the killings were being done by juniors. Juniors are a term used for sons of Mexican wealthy families whose money, influence, and connections can keep them from legal troubles that others cannot avoid. Interestingly, after Murillo's junior remarks, he was soon transferred to another job and refused all interviews involving the Juarez case. The case would later be passed on to Irma Rodriguez Galarza. Prior to having the case handed over to her, Irma was still taking part in the investigation, trying to identify the victims of narco-related executions and possibly tying them together with the missing and murdered women of Juarez. While continuing to investigate, Irma's husband and daughter were tragically gunned down on their family's front porch, killing them both and critically wounding her son in the process. The police would go on to say that the shooting was a result of possible road rage, maybe a drug hit gone wrong, just an accident and a tragic coincidence. Time would pass, and near the end of the year, on November 2002, Mexico's First Lady, Marta Según Fox, publicly would call an end to these murders, as more than 1,000 women dressed in all-black garb would march throughout Mexico City, protesting the police and how the investigation was being handled. As time went on, and more women continued to go missing and be found murdered, many citizens and media alike began to see lead ripper suspects such as Sharif, Los Rebeldes, and the others as more than likely scapegoats. Bodies continue to surface in the city and around its limits. As of 2022, it's estimated that over 500 women have been found brutally murdered in Juarez, and more than triple that have been reported missing. Now, if anyone is familiar with the missing persons and how criminals operate within a certain agreed-upon set of rules in Mexico, it's almost certain that the missing are dead as well, tripling the official body count. While alarmingly high, this unfortunately doesn't take into account the undocumented missing and murdered, which I'm sure would dramatically increase the number of murdered women. As years have gone by, there have been more speculations to who are responsible, or at least to this point contributing to the unbelievable body count. One suspect that was never officially tied to the case, but was actually name-dropped to be the killer by the case's first major suspect, and Sharif, was Alejandro Menez. Interestingly, Alejandro was a junior, an orphan adopted by a wealthy Chihuahuan entrepreneur and businessman, and Guillermo Menez, owner of up to 20 bars and nightclubs. Guillermo had a big influence in Juarez. During the 80s and 90s, Alejandro and his cousin Melchor joined a gang of drug and jewelry traffickers, which were supposedly under the protection of the Mexican government. It was during this time the two would begin their string of murders. Later on, the Menez cousins would pick up another accomplice, an Ana Benavides, a waitress at one of Alejandro's father's bars, who surprisingly had a past involving multiple killings herself. It was during a requested media conference that Sharif would go on to say that the real murderers responsible are Alejandro and Melchor Menez, claiming that while at a bar, Alejandro, while intoxicated and extremely social, would go on to brag about he and his cousin Melchor were responsible for the sexual assault and murder of an alarming number of women. Even with this specific information Sharif had just given to the public, Alejandro and Melchor both would not be questioned. Main speculations being that Alejandro's father's influence and money were keeping both of them out of any trouble. As of 2022, Alejandro's whereabouts are unknown. Another suspect was a Mexican-born serial killer that mainly operated in the US. One Angel Materino Rebeldes, aka the Railroad Killer, was thought to be at least a contributor to some of the killings. Apprehended in 1999, Rebeldes was speculated to be the supposed Ripper because of his strong family ties in the areas of the murders. Rebeldes admitted to killing 7 additional victims in Mexico but was not charged for those. With a body count of at least 16 known victims, Rebeldes was executed in Huntsville, Texas in 2006. Pedro Padilla Flores, aka the Rio Bravo assassin, was another suspect living and operating out of Juarez. Convicted of the sexual assaults and murders of 2 women and a 13-year-old girl back in 1986, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, but only served 4 years before his escape in 1990. Flores continued to roam free, continuing his life of violence and crime before his arrest in the US in 2013 and deportation back to Mexico in 2014, where he now continues to serve his life sentence. There have been many more speculations on who the Ripper was, or at least contributors to the killings, ranging from satanic cults similar to the one ran by Adolfo Costanzo in the mid to late 80s, all the way to the other side of the spectrum, with law enforcement officers ranging in rank from normal policemen to police chiefs and even federal agents. But there's one more speculation, one extremely disturbing and happens to tie in many of the aforementioned suspects and backgrounds. As someone who finds narco culture interesting and has spent some time delving into the subject, the femicide of Juarez has popped up throughout my research, but it wasn't something I really looked into until I found out the two had a possible connection. One of the more disturbing rumors out there, and I don't find hard to believe, is that an overwhelming majority of the female abductions and murders are tied to the cartel. Why? Various reasons. Kidnap and ransom, human trafficking, but the main reason being sexual and violent gratification. Nearing the end of 1995, an envelope containing 10 pieces of paper was found inside a garbage can in the city of Juarez. The pages were written with pencil and in all capital letters. Revealed by the police, the pages would go into extremely graphic detail of how the mysterious author had kidnapped, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered 15 women. The pages also contain explicit drawings. One of the most shocking details in the 10-page letter was that the overwhelming majority of the femicides in Juarez happened during orgies organized by cartels, using these abhorrent acts as footage for supposed snuff films. This shocking 10-page letter was signed by a mysterious individual by the name of Richie. While the true identity of the letter's author has never been found, many police have suspected this 10-page confession to be that of Alejandro Menes. But this has never been confirmed, and the letter remains archived till this day. Now, touching back on the subject of the wealthy and Campos' Jr. remarks, it wasn't just Campos linking the abductions and murders to the wealthy and influential. The UK's Observer reported that many involved in the killings come from multiple wealthy backgrounds, such as landowners, energy suppliers, major drug dealers, and even officials in both police and government. Another media outlet, the El Paso Times, alleged that the guilty parties are prominent men who cross the border regularly, are involved in major businesses, are associated with drug cartels, and even have ties with politicians and, at the time, President of Mexico, Vicente Fox's administration. Some Mexican officials would go on to even specify that 6 people from the Juarez, El Paso area are having the women abducted for orgies, after which, or even possibly during, said women are killed. In a 2002 documentary film, Señorita Extraviada, a specific part of the film would go on to reveal that some of the victims were missing for long periods before their deaths. Some bodies even displaying evidence of ritual sacrifice. In many cases, the only remains that are ever found are clothes and bones, and the bones are often mismatched. Frequently, these bones are found in far less time than it would take a corpse to decompose into a skeleton. And sometimes, these skeletal remains would show up in areas that have recently been searched. In a shocking statement, one female witness who was arrested and sexually assaulted in prison would tell the filmmakers that her captors showed extremely graphic photos of a woman being gang sexually assaulted and beaten before she was then doused in gasoline and burned alive. The young women going missing and found dead are being used to satiate the grotesque appetite of many wealthy individuals, not only throughout Mexico, but around the world. Unspeakable sexual acts and violence is said to be done to these women for the sexual gratification of these individuals for a substantial amount of money. Cartels would find these young women or girls after working long shifts, waiting for their bus or ride home, abduct them, and take them to an undisclosed location and carry out the most violent and obscene orders of whoever is paying, record the horrendous deeds, and send the videos to the paying customer. Now, many of you may think this is indeed a conspiracy and far-fetched. An urban legend maybe? Perhaps. But former cartel members, as well as law enforcement officials, have said otherwise. We would like to think a sadistic operation like this couldn't possibly exist. And hopefully it doesn't. But whether it's true or not, more women, even to this day, continue to go missing and found murdered in the northern region of Mexico, and especially in Juarez. Will we ever know the identity of the Juarez Ripper? Hopefully one day. But until then, one thing is for certain. The female residents of Juarez will continue to live with an extra layer of fear.